Being a parent is tough enough, right? But what if the biggest threat wasn't out in the world, but inside your own home? Picture this. You wake up in the middle of the night and your kid's just standing in the hallway, eyes totally blank, mumbling nonsense. Or you find out some random school friend might be bringing something seriously dark into your place. Stories like this aren't just urban legends. They've happened to real parents who are still trying to figure out what they actually went through. In this video, you're going to hear some seriously creepy stories from parents who face the unexplainable, sleepwalking that defies logic, unseen things that feel like they're watching your family, and secrets hidden right in your own house. What would you do if you realized something or someone was trying to talk to your kid? Or even worse, what if it was already in control? The stories you're about to hear aren't for the faint of heart. Some of them totally mess with your head, and others make you wonder if the terror really stops when the sun comes up. One thing's for sure, after today, you'll never look at your house the same way again. Get ready, 'cause these stories are gonna haunt your nights. Strange friendships. From the time he was little, George just had this thing about attracting different friends. It wasn't just about getting along, it was more like this pattern his mom, Maggie, started noticing. There was always something off about these kids. Blank stares, acting totally strange, stories that didn't add up. But nobody freaked her out as much as Sebastian. From the second that pale, quiet kid showed up at their house, this creepy coldness just settled over everything. The first major red flag was at school. George and Sebastian got busted for this super staged fight, like a whole production that fooled even the teachers. When they got called out on it, they both stuck to these stories that were so convincing you couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. It was like Sebastian had some kind of hold over George, something way beyond just being friends. Maggie got this chill down her spine, realizing her son had never acted like that before. Then came the sleepover from hell. At first it seemed harmless enough. 2 kids watching scary movies and playing video games all night. But in the middle of the night, Maggie woke up to this weird noise. She peeked through the slightly open door and saw Sebastian standing in front of the mirror, whispering to himself. Not just any whispering, though, like he was having a conversation, pausing and getting answers from something. And the messed up part? His reflection seemed to be moving on its own. The next day, Maggie tried to tell herself it was just some kind of game, kids imitating stuff they saw in a movie. But when she mentioned it to other moms, she started to see a disturbing pattern. Sebastian had been kicked out of other schools, always mixed up in violence and messing with people's heads. It hit her. This wasn't just some kid friendship. It was like a mind game, some controlling thing that left everyone feeling uneasy and scared. Then, just like that, Sebastian was gone. Not just him, his whole family. No goodbyes, no trace, no explanations. It was like they never even existed. But for Maggie, the emptiness left behind was even worse than when he was there, because in the silence of the nights that followed, she swore she could hear a whisper in the hallway. Something that sounded just like Sebastian's voice. Sleepover horror. The silence in the house that night was broken only by the sound of the wind against the windows. Maggie was trying to sleep, but something was bothering her. Ever since Sebastian had arrived, the air seemed thicker, like the boy's presence brought something invisible but palpable with it. She tried to push away the irrational thoughts. He was just a kid. But then, around 3 in the morning, a whisper echoed down the hallway. Not a normal whisper, but a muffled dialogue, murmured with precision, and only one voice answering. As she approached the door to George's room, Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. The scene before her eyes was almost surreal. Sebastian was standing in front of the mirror, his head slightly tilted, his eyes wide. He moved his lips quickly, talking to someone or something. But the worst came when he paused and slowly turned his head toward Maggie. His expression wasn't that of a child caught in the act. It was something beyond that, a blank stare as if he was far away. Before she could react, Sebastian smiled. A smile too wide to be natural, and then, in a tone that didn't match a boy's voice, he whispered, "Mr. Jim is here." Maggie felt her throat go dry. The air got colder. George, lying in bed, was sleeping as if nothing was happening. The boy turned back to the mirror and continued murmuring. Fear gripped her, but something in her mind told her not to confront him. Instead, she closed the door and returned to her own room, trembling. The next morning, Sebastian was normal, like nothing had happened. George was laughing and playing with him, unaware of what his mother had witnessed the night before. But Maggie couldn't ignore what she had seen. She decided to investigate discreetly and discovered what she feared. Sebastian had been expelled from 2 schools before arriving there. Reports of strange behavior, aggression towards classmates, elaborate lies, and the most terrifying detail? In every school, he mentioned the name, Mr. Jim. That's when Maggie realized she needed to keep her son away from that friendship. But would it be too late? Something about Sebastian seemed to have left an invisible mark on the house. And in the following days, when George started murmuring to himself while looking in the mirror, she knew the real terror was yet to come. Disappearance. Time passed, but Sebastian's presence still hung over the house like an invisible shadow. George seemed more withdrawn, sometimes muttering words that Maggie couldn't understand. The mirrors had become a problem. She'd catch her son staring into them, lost in thoughts he never shared. But it was at school that things reached a breaking point. A violent fight broke out, and Sebastian was right in the middle of it. Only this time, something was different. The teacher's account left Maggie uneasy. Sebastian didn't seem to be fighting out of instinct or defense. He was smiling, like he was enjoying the chaos. When the principal tried to intervene, he just looked at the teachers and whispered something. Nobody could quite make it out, but one witness swore he had said, "It's no use. Mr. Jim is already here." That was enough for his immediate expulsion, but what no one expected was what would happen next. The next day, Sebastian and his family were gone. No warnings, no goodbyes, no sign of moving. Their house was empty, abandoned as if it had never been lived in. No record of them moving, no moving truck, nothing. It was like they had vanished into thin air. Maggie tried asking the neighbors, but nobody knew anything. The school tried to contact them with no success. No clues, no trace. George seemed affected, but refused to talk about it. He just kept saying that Sebastian had left, without showing any surprise. That bothered Maggie deeply. It was like her son knew more than he was letting on. And in the nights that followed, the silence of the house became heavier. She started noticing small whispers in the hallway, faint noises that seemed to come from nowhere. One of them, one night, sounded exactly like Sebastian's voice. Over time, things went back to normal, at least on the surface. But Maggie could never shake the feeling that something had stayed behind. Like Sebastian had never really left. Like, somehow, he was still there, watching. And when George, months later, whispered, "Mr. Jim," in his sleep, she realized the story wasn't over. A troubled upbringing. From early on, the narrator's home wasn't like others. Growing up in a house ruled by strict religious rules was already tough. But there was something even more disturbing. Their mother. Her faith bordered on fanaticism, and her moments of devotion often turned into strange, almost supernatural episodes. Sometimes in the middle of the night, she'd sit in the living room, mumbling incomprehensible words, her eyes fixed on an invisible point. Other times, she'd say things that only made sense days later, as if predicting the future. The fear started to take hold when these episodes became more frequent. Once, on a seemingly normal day, she picked up a huge snake over 6 feet long with her bare hands. That wouldn't have been so terrifying if it weren't for one detail. Their mother had an uncontrollable fear of snakes. Her whole life, she'd avoided even pictures of those reptiles. So how could she hold that animal without hesitation? As if in a trance, the scene was burned into the narrator's memory, because for a brief moment, their mother didn't seem like herself. There was a pattern in these episodes, but no one in the family dared to comment. It was like talking about it gave even more power to whatever was happening. But the narrator started noticing something even weirder. Whenever their mother had one of these outbursts, the mirrors in the house seemed to fog up, even without reason, as if an invisible presence was there, watching everything. Sometimes, even wet footprints would appear on the floor, even though no one had walked barefoot. Gradually, the feeling that there was something beyond the natural in that house became impossible to ignore. One night, the mother called the narrator and said something unsettling. "If I'm not myself one day, don't believe anything I say." Was it a warning, a cry for help, or a threat? The uncertainty ate away from the inside, and the question that remained was, how many times had this already happened without anyone noticing? The narrator spent years trying to understand what was happening to their mother. Was it an extreme case of religious fanaticism, a psychological disorder, or something that couldn't be explained by logic? Whatever it was, one thing was certain. The terror didn't just come from her words, but from the blank stare that sometimes took over her face, as if something was inside her, waiting to take control again. Church incident. It was a cold night, one of those where even the wind seemed to carry a whisper. The narrator was at church with other members of the congregation, participating in a vigil that would last until dawn. Everything was as usual, until around 4:30 in the morning, when a strange sound echoed through the church's nave. Light. Constant knocks on the main door. Everyone exchanged hesitant glances. Who could be there at that hour? When they opened the door, the sight was terrifying. Her mother was there, but it wasn't exactly her. Her dress was soaked with sweat, her hair disheveled, and her eyes. There was something wrong with them. She walked slowly inside, ignoring the frightened stares around her. Her mouth moved, but the words were just disjointed whispers, nonsensical phrases, as if she were speaking in an unknown language. The silence in the church was absolute. No one dared to approach. The narrator wanted to believe it was just an episode of exhaustion or something explainable. But the air in the church seemed to have gotten heavier since she arrived. The pastor tried to talk to her, but all he got was a fixed, empty stare. She gave a smile, wide, tense, as if someone was pulling the skin of her face from the inside. Then, suddenly, she fainted. The impact of her body against the floor echoed through the hall like a muffled thunderclap. The next morning, when she woke up in her own bed, their mother remembered nothing. Not the church, not what she had said, not how she had gotten there. For her, it was as if the night before had never happened. But the narrator knew the truth. They had seen, they had heard, and, more unsettling than anything, they had noticed something no one else mentioned. When she entered the church that morning, her clothes were wet with sweat, but her feet were covered in dirt, as if she had walked miles barefoot. What really happened that night? What brought her there? And why did her face seem not to belong to her? No answer came, but the fear remained. Because since then, whenever the narrator closed their eyes, they could still hear the whispers their mother murmured that night. And sometimes they seemed to call them by name. Sleepwalking phenomenon. The first time it happened, the oldest son was only 7 years old. It was early morning, and the mother woke up to a low, rhythmic sound coming from the hallway. Getting up, she found the boy there, standing, his bare feet on the cold floor. He was swaying slightly on his heels as if trapped in some kind of trance. His eyes were open but empty. She called him by name, but he didn't react. Then, as if something was guiding him, he walked slowly to the wall and pressed his forehead against it. The scene was frightening, but the doctors said it was just a common episode of sleepwalking. Over time, the episode stopped, and the mother almost forgot about it, until, years later, her youngest son did the exact same thing. Same age, same posture, same wall. Now fear took over. How was that possible? Was it just coincidence? Or was something much darker happening inside that house? The pattern was always the same. She'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of slow footsteps in the hallway. Upon checking, there he was, his feet firmly on the floor, swaying slightly. Sometimes he'd whisper incomprehensible words before pressing his forehead against the wall, as if trying to hear something on the other side. The mother began to feel that it wasn't just a sleep disorder. It was a repeated, almost ritualistic behavior. The most frightening thing happened on a silent night when she decided to film her youngest son during the episode. The next day, she watched the recording and felt a cold shiver run down her spine. For a brief moment, in the reflection of a nearby mirror, there seemed to be another figure there, a motionless shadow, watching. But upon checking the room, there was no one but the boy. Was it a trick of the light, or something that shouldn't have been there? The house held secrets that the mother couldn't understand. Something seemed to want to communicate, but why? And why always that wall? The answer seemed to be hidden, buried beneath years of silence. But she had no idea how close she was to the truth. Hidden mirror mystery. The day of the renovation started like any other. The mother just wanted to freshen up her son's room, repaint the walls, give the space a new look. But when she removed the old wallpaper, she felt a chill run down her spine. Right there, exactly where her sons used to rest their heads during their sleepwalking episodes, something was hidden. A mirror. An old, dusty mirror, embedded in the wall as if it had been sealed for decades. Her heart pounded. How had no one ever known about that mirror? Who hid it there, and more importantly, why? The glass was smudged, but when she cleaned it, she had the strange feeling that something was looking back. The reflection seemed darker, deeper. Was it just a trick of her mind? And yet, the coincidence was too disturbing to ignore. With the mirror exposed, the sleepwalking episode returned, but with something even more frightening. Now, the youngest son didn't just rest his forehead against the wall. He whispered. He spoke disjointed phrases as if he were responding to someone. One night, she gathered the courage to ask, "Who are you talking to?" The boy, still asleep, replied in a voice that didn't sound like his own. "To the one on the other side." Fear took hold. What did that mirror mean? Was it just an old object? Or a passage to something she should never have discovered? The next day she decided to get rid of it, but when she tried to remove it from the wall, she realized it was firmly stuck, as if the house had been built around it. It was as if it was never meant to be touched. That night, as she tried to sleep, she heard a sound coming from the children's room. A sound that made her blood run cold. 3 soft knocks, coming from the mirror, as if something or someone wanted to get out. After hearing these stories, one question lingers. What if this happened to you? If your child started acting strangely, mumbling unknown names, or seeing something you couldn't, what would you do? The truth is, as much as we try to explain everything with logic, some things simply defy any explanation. Did these parents witness supernatural manifestations? Or was the terror only inside their own minds? We may never know the answer. But one thing is certain, many of these stories have not ended. And if there is something lurking in the dark, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, would you recognize the signs? If this video made you think twice before turning off the light tonight, then don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories like this, because believe me, real terror is closer than you think. Now tell me, have you ever experienced anything similar? Leave your report in the comments. Just be careful what might answer back.